"Camille, you are so beautiful. How I envy you." Camille looked at her friend in the mirror. Evelyn looked at her with genuine admiration and at the same time with envy expressing her feelings. She wasn't exaggerating in the slightest. It was obvious that Evelyn was sleeping and seeing how to try on a white dress too, and preferably with a price tag of over 100,000. Emily's other friend was flipping through the magazine as if she wanted to rip the pages out. She didn't seem to be getting into the content of the articles. The expression on her face said that she was not happy about what was happening and wanted to be anywhere but here. Camille wondered if other weddings had such different guests. Some are openly jealous, others are angry. And no one, absolutely no one, is happy for the bride. Maybe the whole world is like that if she didn't realize it when she was young, but in reality people just can't be happy for others. Though what's to say Camille wasn't happy herself, despite the empty hearts she drank, beating fearfully, urging her to flee. Her eyes glittered unhealthily, and somewhere in the back of her mind settled a despondency, a heavy sense of wrong. It was the same feeling she'd had in her school days, when she'd given a wrong answer at the blackboard. "I'm not wrong now. Everything is right," mentally into herself Camille. "There's just no other way to do it. I have no other choice but to marry Stephen." Another oddity, Camille could not call her fiancé other than by his patronymic name. Perhaps it was time to give up the habit. He was not likely to like it if Camille continued it in the future. The hairdresser was working on her hair, and Camille continued to look at her friends. Emily sang more and more gloomily. The hour was not far distant when she would say all she had to say to the bride, and so she did. "Is John coming too?" "Is John coming too?" she asked. Camille blushed. Evelyn interrupted her enthusiastic ahs and oohs and looked at Emily in surprise. "Why? I think it would be kind of weird, showing up uninvited." "And he wasn't invited here, right, Camille?" Camille nodded. What made the hairdresser click her tongue? "Don't move, please. I'm almost done. But at least he knows about your wedding." Emily kept up. "He does," Camille said reluctantly. "And of course I didn't invite him to the banquet. I'm not crazy. Yeah, I'd argue with that. Considering who you're marrying." Evelyn nudged her in the side and pointed at the hairdresser with an expressive look. Camille was grateful to Evelyn for that. Really, it wasn't a good idea to talk like that in front of a stranger. And on heart, Camille would have preferred not to drive them at all. The hairdresser finished her work, complimented the bride, and left. It was Evelyn's turn to express her delight. "My God, Camille, you're beautiful. You're like a princess from a fairy tale." To think Camille looked at herself in the mirror and nodded demurely. Yes, she was beautiful. Except that beauty, it looked kind of cold, and lifeless blonde hair tucked into an intricate hairstyle. The only thing was a boozy curl falling down only because it was allowed to. The makeup is garish and bright, unaccustomed to Camille. She hardly recognized herself in this woman. A woman, exactly. In this image, Camille looked not in her 20s, but perhaps 35. Was this how she had envisioned her wedding when Camille had dreamed of her marriage to John? It was so different, so much simpler, so much more sincere. No fancy dress, something simple and light to wear later for the holidays. Some light floral sundress, no evening hairstyles with lots of hairpins. Camille wanted to just let her braid down. When she did that, the boys at school called her the mermaid. And most importantly, minimal guests. Just the nearest and dearest, Evelyn, Emily, the girls from the store she worked at. And then, of course, her father. When Camille thought of how many people would be at the wedding, she felt sick, at least 100. All of them bosses and bigwigs. Camille's co-workers were out of the question. She was glad that she could invite at least her closest friends to the wedding. And the father. If everything went well, she would soon be able to hug him. The important thing was to get through the night. "So what about John?" Emily asked again. "Did you tell him about the wedding and how did he react?" "I didn't. I just texted him. It's getting better by the hour." "What did he do?" "I don't know. I didn't go on social media anymore. I didn't answer when he called. And I barely left the house. I stayed with my dad." Camille tried not to look at her friend's face. She was embarrassed. Emily was quiet for a moment and said, "I think it's mean." "I think it's clever." Evelyn interceded for her friend. What kind of life was paper with that John? We would live all our lives in a cramped Khrushchevka. Once in a couple of years would go somewhere on vacation. Maybe in 10 years John would be promoted to master, and he would be generous enough to go abroad for his wedding anniversary. And that would be it. But most likely, when they are in their 30s, John will turn into a boring man who spends all his weekends on the couch snuggled up with a beer, and Camille will be busy making borscht for him. Romantic, if you ask me. Emily asked us this with Stephen, keeping her eyes on Camille. What's in store for Camille with him? Evelyn's eyes lit up with excitement. Oh, it's different with Stephen. Why do you ask me that? You know that. Tomorrow she and Camille are getting on a plane to Italy. Rome, Venice, gondolas. I can't even imagine it to that extent. It's beautiful. Maybe they'll go to the Alps. It wouldn't be a trip, it'd be a fairy tale. You have my word. Then they'll come back, and Camille will move into this huge 3-story mansion of his. Stephen will work and provide whatever Camille wants. She would forget that she had ever gotten up at 6 and gone to work. She would go out to restaurants with Stephen in the evenings, spend weekends and vacations abroad with Stephen, or at least in other cities. But what was life? Camille managed to everything said by her friend sounded so luscious and awful that I wanted to cry. Stephen from KSU. Vanessa literally never came off that name, while Camille herself would rather never see or hear it. And it is her future life to serve as a complementary adjunct to Stephen. A picture to his success. Thank you for describing it so well. It's cold, Emily said, but personally I'd go for the borscht. Why is that interesting? Well, because Stephen is 20 years older than Camille. He's old enough to be her father. That was the Middle Ages, Evelyn muttered. They don't see it that way now. Stephen's not bad looking at all. You couldn't give him 40. Emily gave up trying to change her mind and turned to the bride mash. Are you all right? She opened her eyes and shook her head. No, I'm fine. Just a little stuffy from all those nail polishes and asking it's not too late to cancel everything. You know it is, Emily added. Change. Let's get out of here. That Stephen won't do anything to us. Camille smiled sadly. That's exactly what he won't do if I don't marry him. My father might die. And if that Stephen was a normal, kind man, he'd help you just like that, no strings attached. Camille sighed. Okay, girls. What's the point of talking about it if there's any hope for my dad, that I'll do everything in my power just to save him? Pass the time. It's approaching 12. As Camille walks out the door, she is blinded by the flashes of cameras. A whole bunch of photographers seem to be waiting for her in the living room. There were gasps of delight. Camille had not been warned that the festivities would begin at once. As soon as she stepped out of the room that had been set up under the dressing room on the day of the wedding, she was completely dumbfounded by what was happening. Smile, Evelyn whispered to her. These pictures will be seen by your children. Emily, on the other hand, simply shook her hand encouragingly. No matter how hard she tried, Camille couldn't imagine her children. She couldn't imagine her and Stephen having children together. In the girl's understanding, they should have looked like small copies of her fiancé Sauve and slightly crooked legs with a looming paunch. Camille imagined such kids, and she was twitched. Maybe indeed, but her wedding is the one you have to hold on to for your father's sake, she said to herself. At least for now. And what happens afterward, God only knows. Maybe there won't be any children. The last thought was reassuring, which surprised Camille very much. She loved children and dreamed of a large family. And then she suddenly didn't want any more. However, the phrase about children explained what was happening. Stephen had purposely changed the rules and insisted that Camille enjoy herself right here in his house without having to be taken out of her own apartment. He just couldn't bear the thought of even part of the wedding ceremony taking place in such a shabby backyard setting with rusty swings and graffitied garages. I had to agree and even leave my father, who was probably lying alone in his bed right now. Stephen met Camille in the courtyard, dressed to the hilt, in a suit that, despite its simplicity, must have cost more than a bride's dress. Responding to compliments, the girl allowed herself to be taken in a snow-white limousine. All the way Camille did not leave the feeling that she was playing in a cheap, uninteresting play, which is about to end, and she by some ridiculous accident fell in this farce the main role. If Camille had ever been told that everything would turn out this way, she would have laughed, she would have told him to his face. Despite the fact that the girl was born and grew up in a poor family. She was an optimist. Camille never left the confidence that one day everything will turn out well. The main thing is to wait a little. In the meantime, she lived in hope for the best and looked into tomorrow with a smile. Those who knew the girl's story were surprised by this. Camille was a late child to her parents. You could say Jenna had given birth to her at her own risk. Some doctors had discouraged her from doing so. Some were cautious, some were straightforward. You're 45 years old now. There could be all sorts of consequences, said the doctor in charge, with eyes as indifferent as a fish's. Something's wrong with the baby, Jenna was afraid. Did you see anything wrong on the ultrasound? No, but that doesn't mean anything. As you realize, there's still a chance that the baby will be born with abnormalities. You'd better not take any chances. And I see your health is far from perfect. Jenna waved her hand in relief. I'm not worried about myself, I'm strong. The main thing is that my daughter is fine, and then we'll manage. Jenna didn't think anything could go wrong. She had a bad heart and weak lungs. But her optimism and faith in herself more than compensated for these shortcomings. Jenna referred to her illnesses as minor annoyances, and her husband, Christopher, became alarmed. Maybe we shouldn't have a baby, Jenna. Cautiously, he asked. His wife looked at him in surprise. Why not? You said yourself that you dreamed of a big family. Are you my family? Answered Christopher. And I don't know any other. I don't want you to sacrifice your health for my silly fantasies. Jenna smiled, placing a hand on her stomach. It's not a fantasy at all, it's our baby. And I want it as much as you do. I'd risk anything for that. What's meant to be will be. The three of us are happy, believe me. It was the first and only time Jenna deceived her husband. They were never happy. At least the three of them weren't. Jenna died in childbirth. Her heart failed, and the grief-stricken man was left with his daughter in his arms. Christopher almost did not remember the first months, followed by the funeral of his wife, milk formula, endless diapers all merged and mixed in his head. He named his daughter Camille, as his wife had planned, but to his shame, he had to admit that at first he paid a little attention to her, took care of her, bathed her, but mechanically, because it was necessary. The wound left by the loss of his wife was too deep to pay attention to anything else. It was not until Camille was 6 months old that Christopher somehow dressed his daughter. He was surprised to note that her eyes looked just like Jenna's, and she smiled as if she did the same. The realization of this awakened something in Christopher's soul. He first felt shame and guilt before his late wife for treating his daughter so indifferently, as if she were someone else's child, like a doll. Then he fell in love because of the girl's resemblance to Jenna. And even later, Christopher could not even say exactly when he loved Camille for the fact that she, Camille, is not a small copy of his wife, but a person, the like of which there is no one in the whole world. As a child, Camille never gave much thought to the fact that her life was different from other little girls. She didn't have a mother, but Camille never felt like she was missing anything. Both parents. What can I say? Her whole world was replaced by her father. Christopher worked in a factory, and later, when his eyesight failed him, he took a job as a janitor. His strength allowed him to work, his schedule was free, and Christopher, taking the girl from school, had the opportunity to walk with her or take her to the music club at the youth palace. The family lived poorly, but Christopher did not want to limit his daughter in these activities. Camille loved to sing, and although her voice was not the most outstanding, average, but her hearing was good, and music lessons gave her sincere pleasure. It would be better to buy new furniture, neighbor Vanessa told him judgmentally, or would have made repairs. Look how old you live in, and you spend your money on some songs. Camille likes it, Christopher replied. Why should I forbid her? Let her sing. She can sing for free, the neighbor said. What will they teach her at that school? How to shout louder. It's all nonsense. That's what I tell you. In her heart, Vanessa had her sights on the widower, but her excessive directness, callousness, and lack of tact prevented her from getting what she wanted. No romantic, what is there, even friendly feelings neighbor in him did not cause. So Vanessa had no chance of becoming his wife, nor did any other woman. After losing his wife, Christopher focused all his attention on Camille. His whole life consisted of her and depended on her. He never even thought of having an affair with someone else and bringing a stepmother into his home for Camille. The girl answered her father in the same way. She never caused any special problems, except for her stubborn refusal to eat oatmeal, which Christopher tried to feed her as a child. In school did not hooligan, studied average, on 4s, she could not tolerate math, but she never got to 2. And her father didn't ask anything more from her. "You are my swimming," affectionately said Christopher's daughter, when she sang for him any song. And Camille would give him an awkward, funny curtsy. She had no idea that this hobby would attract anyone else's attention besides her father. Camille had been friends with Emily and Evelyn since high school. They'd been there the day she'd met John. The friends were 15 years old. It was August, it was cold to swim, but the summer mood and cloudless sky were calling them to get out into nature. Evelyn from early in the morning for the drums in the car, the door and barely that opened, impatiently exhaled, "Gather. Let's go to the beach." "What beach?" Camille glanced sleepily at the clock at 8. "That's right, it's 8 o'clock, Evelyn argued. "At this rate, you're on vacation and you're sleeping all your life. School's coming up and you should be in bed because you can't sleep in the fall. You'll have to get up early," Camille said. But without any irritation, she fully recognized her friend's rightness. It was necessary to catch the last days of summer and take everything from life. Even if that meant a strip of wild beach 5 stops from home and 1 bottle of lemonade for everyone. "I'll call Emily now," Camille said. Evelyn nodded seriously. "Call. Because we're up and she's asleep." While Camille was getting ready, while she was hastily frying eggs and eating breakfast, a joyous excitement was slowly but surely building up in her soul. She did not know what she expected from this trip. She had been to the beach dozens of times during the summer and knew every pebble there. And yet Camille felt that on this day something special should happen, some miracle that would turn her life upside down. One experiences such things only in one's youth. Something told Camille that her life was about to change. They met Emily at the bus stop. She arrived before her friends and looked like she was late for an important meeting. They were just going to the beach. That was Emily's specialty. She took everything seriously, even if it was just buying bread. Ours admired her friend. Even though they were the same age, she thought of Emily as a kind of big sister. "Hi," Evelyn shouted and waved to her friend. "How long have you been waiting? 5 minutes?" Emily replied discreetly. "A bus just left." "But I'm sorry we're late. There's another one coming, and it might be even better than the last one." "How could it be better?" Camille was surprised. "They're all the same and old in our town." And trembling. Evelyn, conspiratorially, winked and informed, "And there will be more handsome boys in it. Clear to you." The friends looked at each other. Emily asked cautiously, "Why is that?" "Because I'm always lucky." "What's not to understand?" "If I go to the beach at the end of summer, I will not leave without an adventure. I have to meet someone. Clearly this school is full of nerds." Emily tiredly rolled her eyes. Camille smiled shyly when it came to relationships with boys. Evelyn was ahead of the curve, or at least ahead of her friends. She'd even had some semblance of a relationship with 8th grader Robert, which however had quickly ended. Robert, not on the squeak of money, on a decent bouquet for her birthday. And Evelyn decided she didn't need a fiancé like that. That wasn't the point, though. The main thing was that Evelyn knew how to kiss. In the eyes of Camille and Emily, that was an achievement, putting her friend on a par with the adults. Camille herself only socialized with her classmates, and those only looked at her as an ordinary girl. One of the many crushes Camille had never experienced. That's why Evelyn's fervor frightened her a little. "Are you going to meet someone?" she asked her friend cautiously. "Of course. I told you, maybe we shouldn't. Let's have a quiet, relaxing girls' night out. We had a bachelorette party every day all summer. The 3 of us went to her, Evelyn, all the time. It was like we were inseparable. Don't you get bored? I'm going to do something fun tonight. You'll see." She was the first to jump on the bus, and Emily whispered to Camille she won't do anything. "Don't worry." "Why do you think that?" "Because Evelyn may think she's queen, but she's only queen within the confines of our school. And outside her walls, anything could be." This explained little to Camille because she thought Evelyn was very pretty, unlike her reckless and flamboyant friend. Camille, in her 15, had no makeup at all and looked quite girlish. Skinny, angular. About 13 years old, no more. No one, except for the pretty girl's father, thought she was pretty. However, Camille woke up with a sense of wonder in her soul. This day everything was to change definitively and irrevocably, once and for all. Summer was coming to an end, so the beach was deserted that morning. Somewhere in the distance, an old man and a little boy about 3 or 4 years old were walking. And there wasn't a soul in the part where her friends were seated. Emily spread out the blanket. Camille took cookies and lemonade out of the bag. The friends sat down. Evelyn continued to look around, her eyes full of such genuine disappointment that Emily grinned. No princes around. "There will be," Evelyn muttered. "Of course they will. Who could argue with that? Just not here and not tonight. Now you'd better sit down and make an easy face. You look like you got a D in the quarter." Evelyn obeyed and sat down, though she still looked very unhappy. Camille handed her the lemonade and put her arm around her shoulders. "Don't be upset. We're here for a vacation." They had come to get to know each other. One thing doesn't prevent another. "If you don't stop acting like that, I'd call you a bore," Camille warned. "It doesn't suit you." Nerdiness. Emily and I's part. Evelyn finally stopped frowning and giggling. "I didn't realize it at first. I'm not lucky to have Emily around. She's so serious that guys can sense it from a mile away and scatter in every direction." Emily was indifferent to the remark. She wasn't above listening to Evelyn's chatter, and she certainly wasn't interested in making dubious acquaintances on the beach. Camille looked from one friend to the other and suddenly suggested, "Would you like me to sing to you?" she said. Her friends stared at her in amazement, and there was a lot to be surprised about. Camille was usually shy about her singing and never performed anywhere but the music class and her own kitchen. Evelyn nodded. "Well, sing, of course. We've been wanting to hear you sing for a long time, and you've been holding back. How about a song from Titanic?" Camille was embarrassed. "Probably not. You know I'm not very good at English. And I'm not very good with modern songs. That's news." Evelyn was surprised. "What do you sing, Russian folk or something?" "Oh, Frost, eh?" Camille nodded. Evelyn burst out laughing. "Then no, better not. It's the same kind of song my father sings when he's drunk. I get enough of that at home." Emily, who continued to stare at Camille, suddenly objected. "I want to hear it. Please sing." "Do you really want to?" shyly asked Camille, who was beginning to regret that she had dared to make the suggestion out loud. "You don't joke about jokes, do you? Evelyn is the master. Am I being serious?" Oops, avoiding looking at her friends lest she lose her resolve. Camille fixed her gaze on the water and sighed. She wasn't. Her music school teacher had always convinced her students that a real singer shouldn't be afraid to perform anywhere and in front of any audience. And even though Camille did not consider herself a great artist, but the audience in front of her were not God knows what kind of girls, with whom she was familiar from early childhood. For some reason, it was even more frightening than if Camille had been performing in front of strangers. She sighed, closed her eyes, and sang. The song the girl was singing was one that they had been through recently. The sad old romance was one of those songs that made Camille's heart sink. It spoke of the love of a young man and a girl who had parted forever. Even though Camille had never been in love, she understood perfectly well what the heroine of the song was feeling, and she put her whole soul into this romance. The friends listened in silence. At the end of the song, Camille suspected that they had run away, unable to endure such art. She opened her eyes, cautiously expecting to be deeply disappointed. Yet here they were, looking at Camille as if they were seeing her for the first time. She smiled shyly and asked, "What do you think?" "Cool," Evelyn muttered. "Camille, you're a talent. You're really big." "Good for you," confirmed Emily. "I didn't know you had such ability. Why haven't you ever sung for us?" Camille didn't have time to answer. Applause and boyish applause came from outside. A voice shouted bravo. The girls looked over there in surprise. Half hidden behind the mice, a rough-looking boy with a fishing rod in his hands was looking at them. They hadn't noticed him because of the mice. They figured there was no one on the beach. Evelyn recovered from her surprise and pointed a finger at him with an accusing gesture. He'd overheard. Emily nudged her in the side. "Why weren't you listening?" "I was listening. That's what a song is." If he was hiding, he was listening. Evelyn didn't concede. What kept him from showing up and coming to us? despite her recent chatter about boys. It was obvious that Evelyn didn't like the stranger at first sight. Camille did not pay the slightest attention to her words. She looked at the black boy and felt herself blushing. He didn't take his eyes off her either. "You sang well," the boy said. "Thank you. My grandmother used to sing in the choir. I know you have a talent for this kind of thing." Camille couldn't find anything to say. Her embarrassment was at an all-time high. Evelyn whispered unhappily, "I don't know what you're doing in the bushes." The guy didn't even look at her. He raised the fishing rod above his head, and now it became clear why his friends did not notice him. Fishermen are usually quiet, and someone dressed in a t-shirt of protective color is impossible to see unless he wants to. Evelyn wanted to say something else, but Emily smacked her in the side again, harder. She seemed to realize more from the look on Camille's face than she could say about herself. Her thoughts and feelings were in a mess. She had never spoken so easily to a strange boy, not to her classmates, and certainly not sung for him. Camille felt two completely contradictory urges to run away from the stranger as fast as she could and to ask him how he liked the song. Emily shifted her gaze from one to the other and pulled Evelyn by the arm. "Your mascara's coming undone. Let's step back. It needs fixing." Evelyn looked at her in surprise. "Why?" "I have a mirror in my purse. I can look in here." Emily raised her eyebrows meaningfully and nodded toward the boy. Then, without waiting for an answer, she stood up and forcefully dragged Evelyn away. Where did the strength come from? Emily had always been thin, pale. Duan would fly away, but for her friend's sake she was willing to do anything. For the first and only time in her life she acted as a matchmaker, and no one could say for good or for ill. "You shouldn't have done that," Camille whispered to her friend as she watched the preparations for the wedding. A smartly dressed woman from the registry office was discussing something with the groom's witness. Or maybe she was just flirting with him. You wouldn't know it right away. Two strangers nearby were discussing someone's dress, which was obviously tasteless and fake. Camille's whispering was unheard, and Emily didn't immediately understand it. "What are you talking about? What did I do that time on the beach? I wish you hadn't helped John and I get acquainted. Evelyn would have chased him away and everything would have been fine." Emily raised her eyebrows in surprise. "Okay, so you think losing the love of your life is a big deal? Better then than now. Wouldn't have hurt so much." "It's not too late to give it up," Emily said, nodding at the tastelessly ornate archway, the flowers of the guests strolling by, and the restaurant's huge, stuffy room, where there was no room to breathe. Camille wondered for the umpteenth time why Stephen had decided to have the wedding in such a place. When was it summer? With the beautiful weather outside, it was just sinful to sit indoors. "No," she shook her head. "It's too late. I've made up my mind." "Do you think if your father knew the truth, he would have agreed to this marriage? Would he have agreed to you buying his life at that price?" "Not buying his life, saving it. In your case, it's the same thing." Camille said nothing. Emily lowered her voice even more and said, "You're selling John. Think about what it would be like for him." Camille shook her head so violently that her perfect hair almost fell apart. "So maybe this is for the best too. Sooner or later John will find another girl. Better than me, not like me. Treat her nice and he'll be happy. God has mercy." That's what it seems to say. Somehow Evelyn, who had come up to them, had caught on to what they were talking about and immediately rushed to the attack. "Leave her alone," she said to Emily. "Camille is right. You've already made a mess of things in the past. At least let her live in peace now." Camille took a glass of champagne from the nearest table and looked at the bubbles bubbling in it. Evelyn's reproaches were unfair. She felt completely calm. What would happen, as it should. And her dislike for her future spouse could probably be suppressed. Nasha remembered the day she had first met John. Her friends had left, and a conversation started between the two of them. Shy at first, because John was also feeling out of place, and then increasingly animated. Camille learned that the boy went to a nearby school, lived with his grandfather, and was into soccer and fishing. His parents had died years ago, as had Camille's mother. And that was the only similarity between them. At first glance, it might seem that there could be nothing in common between the thin, airy Camille, with her singing and dreams, and this shaggy-haired boy. And yet she talked. They couldn't stop. "Do you like singing?" Camille asked, wondering if she had asked the right question. What if he took offense? Few boys were into singing. At least not at the music school Camille went to. There were far more girls than boys. John shook his head. "I don't. But I love to hear someone sing. I told you before, my grandmother sang. If she were on TV, she'd show everyone how to sing. But you sing well too. Since my grandmother died, I've rarely heard anyone sing as well as you." He seemed to be speaking sincerely, without flattery. Camille has become very pleasant. "Then I'd like to watch you play soccer," she said. "Because it's not fair. You've heard me sing and I've never seen you play." John didn't try to talk back or make excuses. Just said, "Okay, come to Sime today, to the courtyard of our school, we play there. Just don't expect our team to win." The goalkeeper fell off his bike and broke his leg. The main striker is on vacation at sea. It's not going to be a good game. "I'll still come," said Camille. "I'm interested in watching the game." To her own surprise, the girl said sincerely. Camille had never been interested in sports and moving games, but for John's sake she had forgotten her past tastes. Perhaps it was love at first sight, though Camille did not realize it immediately. At first she thought she had just found a new friend, another friend like Evelyn and Emily. However, Camille soon had to admit that something didn't add up. Her heart didn't sink or her knees rise when meeting her friends. Nor did she dare so carefully, somehow worrying that John wouldn't like her new dress. Camille came to John's soccer games. He never missed a concert where she performed. When the music school students performed at City Day in the park, Camille was the only girl in her class to receive a huge bouquet of roses. "White is my favorite," whispered Camille. She lifted the bouquet to her nose and inhaled its fragrance with pleasure, the first time she had ever been given flowers. And until this moment, Camille had no idea she had a favorite, and certainly not her favorite shade of roses. Now she realized that they were. She would remember this snow-white bouquet with snowy, silk-like petals for the rest of her life. It must be expensive, Camille realized. Where did you get so much money? John did not answer this question for a long time, but Camille, fearing that he might not get into something dangerous for her sake, pestered him again and again. Finally, he confessed that he had been helping at the grocery store near my house for a few nights. Camille was ready to cry at that confession. The roses had lost much of their charm. She felt sorry for John. "You didn't have to do that," she said, lowering her gaze. "No risk for me, please. What's there to risk?" John wondered. "Could you have pulled your back? My dad had one once. He was sore for a long time." Or dropped something on his foot, or Camille couldn't put her feelings into words and fell silent. Tears choked her. John hugged her, stroked her head. "No risk. I promise. All right, I'll find another part-time job. But you'll still get the flowers." "I can't get out of it." That night they kissed for the first time. Since then, Camille had always associated kissing John with the smell of roses and tears, as if one was inseparable from the other. Here, in the banquet hall, Evelyn and Emily continued their argument, unheeded by the little quarrel that had broken out between the friends. Camille carried her thoughts back in time. Back then, at 15, she hadn't thought about the future, much less imagined it would be like this. Marriage to a man she didn't care for, a sick father and no education. Camille had graduated from college. But her dreams of a conservatory remained dreams. What's singing when you have to look after your father and earn a living? Camille started working part-time while she was still studying. First, she handed out flyers advertising cosmetology salons on the street. Then she took hours in a small cafe near her home, carrying trays of coffee and cakes. I watched a couple in love, which made up the bulk of the visitors. She and John went to the cafe very rarely. The girl had enough to do at work. Besides, from her youth, she did not like pathos. We sat at the table. Camille preferred a trip to the beach, where she first met John, or a trip to a pizzeria. Lace and gilding were always foreign to her. It seemed a mockery of fate that it was she and not, for example, Evelyn, who had always been drawn to luxury, who was now in the restaurant. After graduating from college, Camille got a job in a flower store by accident, and without even thinking that she would be hired there. Camille went to the interview with full confidence that she was just wasting her time. No experience, no education, florist. Who would want someone like that? But she was lucky. Camille knew the girl who had worked there before her. Jenna was in the same group with her and, going to leave for Moscow after graduation, offered her place to her friend. You wanted to look for a new job anyway, and here it is in your hands. Go for it, she persuaded Camille. She shook her head doubtfully. I don't know. I've never worked with flowers. It must be difficult, right? No, is it? She laughed. Programming or chemistry is complicated, but here it's nothing special. You will learn to collect bouquets and it will go. You will work in a beautiful place among flowers and fragrance. It's every girl's dream. Camille shrugged her shoulders uncertainly. She loved flowers, but she had never dreamed of picking bouquets. Though, she had to admit, Jenna was right. Floristry was definitely more interesting than shifting some papers or leaking tables in a cafe. So Camille decided to give it a try. All right, I'll go to the interview, she said after a little thought. They won't hire me anyway. I can't say anything. Fighting spirit. Jenna laughed. They'll hire you. Don't even think about it. I made friends with the boss while I was working there. Put in a good word for you, and she likes you. Just keep your tail between your legs. Wendy's got a thing for the perky. Camille was never a spunky girl, but she promised her friend she'd try. However, the notorious Wendy wasn't so scary after all. The owner of a high-end flower shop wouldn't even look at her. Camille's resume, consisting of 2 pathetic entries. The promoter and waitress frowned upon hearing that the girl had never dealt with flowers. But Camille had taken the job nonetheless. Can you tell the difference between daisies and dahlias? Asked Wendy. Of course. Then you can go to work, if you have a head on your shoulders. The girls will teach you the rest. So Camille started working in the store. Not to say that it was easy, especially at first, but the girl quickly got used to it, learned how to make bouquets, learned how to choose the right flowers, and she liked the customers. Mostly they were positive people anticipating a holiday or hopeless romantics. Camille felt warm at the sight of them. John, learning of her work, jokingly feigned resentment. You can't be surprised by flowers now, he said. You'll have to come up with something original, a flower queen. Why not? Give me daisies, daisies, surprised John. It wouldn't be hard to go to the fields to get them. But Camille laughed. Not to get them, but to them. Let's get out of town on Sunday. You told me long ago about a beautiful place near the village? Let's go there. John loved nature as much as Camille. That's why his eyes lit up too. Sure, let's go then. Sunday at 9 I'll go to your house. We'll make sandwiches and have a picnic. However, their plans were not destined to come true. On Saturday it started to rain in the evening, and it rained until the morning. The following weekend Camille worked. Another week later John worked. He worked at a car service and was on a floating schedule, which is very inconvenient for young people dreaming of a date. After a while, the very memory of that trip faded into oblivion. And then Camille met Stephen. It was on a rainy fall day, as gray and dreary as the one that had derailed their trip out of town with John. Camille trimmed the roses, involuntarily revisiting her and John's past. Roses always reminded her of it, of that concert where she had felt like a star for the first time in her life, of their boyfriend's timid advances. The doorbell rang, and Camille was distracted from her thoughts, smiled politely and turned to the visitor. Good afternoon. The visitor was a man in his 40s. He looked like a man in an expensive suit and tie. They usually show bankers like that in movies. He mumbled something in reply, without looking at Camille, and began to look at the shop window. Can I show you something? After a pause, Camille asked. Perhaps, the man agreed. I need a bouquet for my business partner. And your business partner is a woman? Naturally. I wouldn't buy flowers for a man. I was just checking, Camille smiled, just in case. In my work, I've had all sorts of occasions. And how old is your partner? The man shrugged. Who knows, 50 or even more does not matter. The main thing is that she's a bitch. Smiling was not easy, but Camille forced herself to do it, demanded the name. Walking over to the display case, she pointed to the bouquet she'd picked this morning. How do you feel about giving your partner white lilies? Strict yet elegant. The man finally looked at Camille and nodded slowly. I think it would suit me. I mean, not me. Camille took the bouquet out of the display case, still feeling the gaze of the customer. She corrected the bud who had been drinking, added lenta. All this time the visitor looked at her, then asked, do not treat a cup of coffee. It seems to be your custom here." Camille was embarrassed. It was indeed customary to offer customers a cup of tea or coffee, but she had forgotten about it in her reverie. "Yes, of course, right away. What kind of coffee do you like?" "Americano. And no sugar or cream. They ruin the flavor." While making coffee, the girl continued to feel the customer's gaze on her. "Why is he looking at her like that?" she thought in her heart. It's terribly unnerving, with great difficulty forcing herself to keep a friendly expression. The girl handed him a cup of coffee. "Please, thank you." The man took a sip and suddenly asked, "And you've been working here for a long time?" 2 months. "That's what I thought." The man nodded. "Why?" Camille dared to ask. All florists who have been working for 2 months have a special look on their faces. The customer shakes his head. "No. It's just that the last time I came here was about 3 months ago." And the girl in the hall was different. "And we work in shifts," Camille said politely, who was disliking the strange customer more and more. Why is he looking at her like that? As if he wasn't choosing flowers, but was looking at her. The customer didn't say anything to this remark, but drank more coffee and suddenly introduced himself as Jenkins Stephen. Camille did not know what to say to this. The rules that were spelled out in their salon said nothing about when a customer might want to introduce themselves to the salesperson. Therefore, she simply answered Camille, introducing herself as long-windedly pathetic as this Jenkins was silly. What was she like? "Just Camille." Stephen nodded, taking note of her answer, and then suddenly said, "I'll take another bouquet from you." "What kind?" A little surprised, Camille asked. Jenkins did not seem so benevolent as to give flowers left and right. He looked thoughtfully around the display case and pointed to the scarlet roses. "This one." Camille wondered how Jenkins would look with 2 bouquets in his hands with his looks. And one was unnecessary. Rugged, a little Bruce, a man of indeterminate age. What kind of romantic is he? Although perhaps Camille was jumping to conclusions. Maybe Jenkins was buying flowers for a relative like, say, his mother? Camille realized how wrong her conclusions were when Stephen handed the bouquet to her. "These are for me." Stunned, Camille asked, "Why? Why do you think women give flowers? To make them feel good, don't you think?" Camille awkwardly accepted the flowers. She felt no joy from the bouquet she received, more like endless surprise. "I should probably go." Jenkins put the cup aside, stood up. "We should give flowers and waits, damn her." "Good day to you," Camille muttered. "I'm not saying goodbye." The bell above the door apologized, "Hush, hush," and Camille continued to stand looking at the bouquet. She had always loved roses, but this bouquet gave her a vague fear. "Why are you looking at those flowers like that?" Wendy, who had come back from the back room, asked. "You look like there's a snake hiding in there." "A client gave it to me." "Which one is that?" Wendy immediately rushed to the window and curiously penetrated the glass, trying to see something behind and sparkling streams of water from the sky. "There's a huge black tank-like vehicle over there," Camille nodded. Wendy stared at her in surprise. "Are you kidding?" "No, I'm not." "What's so special about that car?" "Driver, that's Jenkins' car." I recognized it right away. That's how he introduced himself. "Who's Jenkins?" "I don't know him." Wendy looked at her like her partner was playing a trick on her. "You don't know Jenkins? Really? I mean, he owns a legitimate company and the waterfront restaurant. Is this the first time you've heard of it?" Camille shrugged her shoulders. "I've never been interested in such things, where the directors are and where I am." Although the girl was actually shocked. She had never been interested in business and had no idea who owned what in their small town. But not hearing about the Oaknell company and the restaurant was simply impossible. They had no other installers, and there was only one decent establishment in which to hold a banquet. So Jenkins could rightly be called the local czar. Camille felt the bouquet she had received stinging her hands. Without thinking for a second, she stepped forward and handed the bouquet back to the shop window without taking it for herself. Wendy asked curiously, "Would you take it?" "I have no idea." "What's there to guess? It wasn't given to me. And I'm married. Anyway, you're probably right. You should use the money from the cash register to buy flowers. You've seen enough of this place. Why bring them home?" Wendy left, and Camille thought indignantly that she hadn't even mentioned John, as if his existence wasn't a good enough reason for Camille not to accept bouquets from other men. as if he didn't exist at all. Camille could not resist telling her friends about the incident at the first meeting. As expected, the girls took it differently. Evelyn's eyes instantly lit up. "Jenkins gave you flowers? Great." She stretched out. "Honestly, if someone other than you had told me that, I wouldn't have believed it." Emily looked worried. "What are you going to do?" she asked, looking anxiously into Camille's face. "I don't know anything, I guess. What's there to do? He probably won't come back." The friends looked at each other and assured Camille he would come. Their voices were different, too. Evelyn said the word with envy and hope, and Emily with sympathy. Camille decided not to get upset ahead of time and not to fill her head with problems that might not even be there. She would not tell John about anything, so as not to worry him for nothing. Besides, Camille had other things to worry about. Her father had caught a bad cold and was down with pneumonia. In addition, his heart had lately begun to fail. And Camille, remembering the fate of her mother, felt a great deal of anxiety about it. "Calm down, you," Wendy told her, watching her partner fret after every call home. "Your mother had it congenitally and your father had it age-wise. So," Camille didn't understand, what was the difference here? Wendy shrugged as if surprised by the question. "Well, it's common in old age. Everyone has blood pressure or a heart condition, but they can still live to be 100. My dad's not everybody." Camille objected with a sudden harshness that was surprising to herself. "And you wouldn't say anything like that if it were your father." Wendy pouted and said nothing, and Camille continued to think about her father. "He's been getting really tired lately. Harder than usual. He didn't complain too much about his heart, but she knew how quickly he ran out of pills and had to go to the drugstore for new ones. And then there was this inflammation." Camille was completely absorbed in her own thoughts. She picked up the bouquet automatically. Her head didn't know what her hands were doing. The front door fell off. Camille almost dropped the flowers in surprise. "Someone's here to see you," Wendy muttered still resentfully, and disappeared into the back room. Camille glanced at the man who had entered and felt goosebumps run up and down her body. Jenkins again. Nothing good could come of his visit. "Good afternoon," he greeted Camille with a broad smile. "I can't help but notice that flowers suit you very well. You've chosen your place of work quite well. I can tell you that." Camille forced herself to smile. "Hello." If it wasn't in a store, where Camille had to be polite to everyone, she would have preferred to pretend she didn't know Jenkins. Cross the street. If the meeting had happened in the city, turning away in the grocery line, though they probably couldn't have met in any other place, it was highly unlikely that Jenkins was walking through the city on foot. And they probably bought groceries at different places. It was even possible that Jenkins only ate restaurant food. According to Wendy, he had a chef from France working for him. Camille convinced herself to be a professional, not a backwoods, resentful, incomprehensible girl, and asked, "Did you need a bouquet for a business partner again?" "Yes, but not for a partner. It's my cousin's birthday, and you couldn't send a courier to pick up the flowers?" Camille asked. Of course, she didn't want to be rude mentally. "Do you know what kind of flowers your sister prefers?" she asked. Jenkins thought for a moment. "What can you recommend? Let's think about it. Could you tell me how old your sister is and what she likes in general? What are her hobbies?" Jenkins grinned. "Hobbies? Probably none, except for beauty parlors and gossip. That's not important. Would you rather tell me what kind of flowers you would choose for yourself?" "Roses tried on," Camille replied, though that wasn't true. With his recent gifts, Jenkins, as if to sully her memories of that concert, after which John gave the most expensive gift in her life. And on heart, the wildflowers were much more to the girl's liking. "So I guessed right last time," Jenkins clarified. "You were. But to be honest, I returned that bouquet to the window," Camille admitted. "I hope you won't be offended." Jenkins was silent much longer this time. "Before I ask, may I know the reason why you did that?" "I have a fiancé," she said. For some reason, she blushed. Jenkins was not particularly impressed by her statement. "Was I married?" he said, shrugging his shoulders carelessly twice. "What's the big deal?" Camille didn't say that she didn't care and that it wasn't very decent to put out such information like that. "But I didn't because of the same written code of politeness they had in the store, but also because of simple shyness, of course." "Have you had wives in the past? Do I have a fiancé now?" she said discreetly. That's the difference. Kovalyov waved his hand, as if urging her to be quiet, and pointed to the bouquet of roses that stood closest to them. This time it was snow white. "Give me those flowers." Camille took the bouquet out of the display case and warned, "If you are going to give this bouquet to me, don't. I won't take it anyway." Jenkins looked at her carefully, as if he suddenly saw something new in the girl, and grinned. Proud then. "Oh well, that's more interesting. I'm going out tonight. I have a lot to do, and I'll be back later. So I'm not saying goodbye." Camille could barely keep from throwing the bouquet she was holding on the floor. What did this man imagine? That she would pay with happiness, having gotten to know him very slowly and with great difficulty. But Christopher was still on the mend when only a residual cough remained from the recent pneumonia. The man informed his daughter that he was returning to work. Camille was horrified by the news, cleaning the streets again. "Dad, but is your heart okay?" Christopher interrupted her with exaggerated cheerfulness. "I've still got a little bit of firepower left in me. I can handle it." No matter how hard Camille tried, she could not convince him. Christopher remained deaf to all her entreaties. "Nothing will happen to me," he said. "I'm not an ancient old man yet, my daughter. I'd rather work than languish idle. Here at home you need help too. We can't live on your salary alone. Do you have a pension?" Camille reminded me with a wink of her nose. Even though she knew she couldn't change her father's mind, he'd been like that all his life. If he made a decision, he'd do it. "I can't stay at home." Christopher repeated softly but adamantly. "Everything will be all right. You'll see." Nor did Camille think she was to blame by then, and Jenkins had not been heard from. After that unpleasant conversation about flowers, he came to the salon a couple more times to present her with a bouquet. Camille returned it to the display case, and only then to invite her to the restaurant. "I already told you I have a boyfriend," Camille remarked with some irritation. "You did," agreed Jenkins. "But that would be the hunter instinct in me, when a girl is busy, and there's something to fight over, right? Only I'm not a frightened doe, and we're not in the jungle," replied the girl. "Yes, we are, and humans are savages at heart." Jenkins disagreed. "It's just that you haven't realized it yet." Camille was annoyed that Jenkins called her by her first name, but she didn't dare to protest. She was afraid that her stamina would finally leave her, and she didn't want to lose face in the workplace. On the day of her father's accident, Camille had felt a vague uneasiness from the morning. She herself could not explain what it could be connected with. Some vague premonition of misfortune. Could it be the weather itself? A blizzard seemed to be brewing. Camille hated snow, at least not since her father took a job as a janitor. Somehow, Dad thought she couldn't get cold in a job like that. He always had a t-shirt to wring out after his shift. But my heart, God, if only there was a little snow. There's been plenty of it this winter already. She was serving some lady who'd dropped off flowers for her best friend, and out of the corner of her eye, she saw Jenkins enter. Just what she needed, the girl thought. Maybe this is what my intuition predicted about meeting a man I can't stand. Jenkins waited for the visitor to leave. He approached Camille. "Good afternoon," she said with a practiced smile. "Can I get you anything?" He shook his head. "I will offer you an evening at the restaurant. Will you come with me tonight?" "I can't. I'm working tonight. And even if I could, I have a boyfriend. Remember we talked about this?" Jenkins smelled like alcohol, and it scared Camille. She knew people could do a lot of things in that state. "A guy's a guy," Jenkins muttered angrily. "Today he is, and tomorrow he isn't. And it's not every day you get an offer to go to a restaurant." "I really can't go with you," Camille said, taking a step away from him. "My father's sick. I have to go home. First the boyfriend, now the father. Do I have to ask for a blessing to take you out?" Camille said nothing, begging Jenkins to leave as soon as possible. He really didn't bother her. He snorted, grudgingly, like an angry bull. He muttered some sort of swear word and walked out the door. This time the bell rang for a particularly long time, as if to warn Camille of something. The feeling of distress that had been with her since morning became even stronger. Camille could hardly wait until the end of the working day, glanced at her watch, and could hardly keep from leaving everything and rushing out. Finally, her shift came to an end. Camille ripped off her name tag, threw on her coat, and sprinted out the door. The weather had abated by nightfall, but transportation was poor. Camille stomped impatiently to the bus stop and thought she would sooner turn into a snowman than wait for a bus. It was impossible to call a cab. It seems that half of the city this evening decided to ignore public transportation and return home in comfort. At last, the crowded bus pulled up to the stop. Camille pulled herself onto it, ignoring the discomfort. All her thoughts were of her father. Even Jenkins with his obsessive advances didn't matter, only her father. Camille realized something was wrong as she ran toward the house. There was an ambulance and a crowd of gawkers in front of the driveway. What had brought them here at this hour? Or rather, who? Camille realized who had caused the commotion when she got closer. Her father, standing on, clearing the pavement for us, in a strangely awkward pose. The girl didn't remember the rest of it well. Only one word, accident, was stored in her memory. How could it have happened? Time after time, she asked, sitting in the corridor of the hospital. There was no answer to that question. John just put his arms around her, pulled her close to him. Camille cried. The weather was bad. Emily said in a muffled voice. The driver might not have seen the man in the road. But why my father? Why was it necessary to race around the yard like that? Camille was a rather peaceful person, but suddenly she felt an unaccustomed anger. She wanted to throw up and throw down, and to find the man who had hit her father with the car and tear him to shreds. We have to find out who it was. She said firmly, this guy needs to be prosecuted. Take away his license, before someone else gets hurt. We will, John assured her. What's more important now is that your father gets well, Emily added. Everything else can wait. Christopher had undergone a complicated operation and was recovering, but too slowly. The fractures were growing, but long-standing heart problems were worsening. When she was called to the doctor's office, Camille had no idea until the last minute what the conversation would be about. She thought the doctor wanted to let her know when the cast could be removed from her leg. The last thing she expected was more trouble. Your father will need surgery. Just like that, the doctor said without any preamble. The message made Camille feel sick. An operation. But you said his injuries weren't just fractures. It seems that everything that happened to your father had a negative impact on his cardiovascular system. You understand what we're talking about, don't you? Camille nodded. She understood. In fact, she'd had a similar conversation with a cardiologist a couple of years ago. It seemed then that the time would never come when it would be impossible to do without surgery. Because Camille knew how much it would cost. And she knew she didn't have that kind of money. How much time is left? She asked in a weak voice. 3 or 4 months, the doctor replied. Don't take too long. To Camille it sounded like 3-4 days. Finding the necessary amount of money in such a short time was impossible anyway. The whole of the next week was spent thinking about where to get the money. Sell something? Camille suggested nervously. Go from corner to corner, maybe the apartment. But Dad would never agree to that, and we have nothing else. I could borrow some, Emily offered. Evelyn and I could. Evelyn nodded, but without much enthusiasm. Camille smiled weakly. Thank you, but it won't do any good. The money you have won't be enough anyway, and I don't want to rob you. What kind of rip-offs? We're friends. Emily was indignant. Evelyn, who had been thinking deeply about something, suddenly said, if you ask Jenkins for money, he could help, and it wouldn't cost him anything. The other question is what it would cost me. Camille whispered. The mere mention of that name made her shiver. Emily decided to change the conversation and said, okay, we need to find out who did this to your father. He's the one who should be paying for the surgery. He's the one who made it happen. Camille nodded sadly. I wish I could, but how can I do that? What about the police? Did they say anything? No one saw anything. No witnesses. The investigation continues. It seems to me they'll go on forever. Camille paused for a moment and added, maybe I should sell a kidney. You know, like I've heard in the movies, they pay good money for that. Yeah, sell it on the market. Emily said disapprovingly. That's the smartest thing you've ever done. Do you think your father would refuse to sell the apartment, but agree that you would make the sacrifice? I just don't know what to do, Camille admitted, wiping away the tears in her eyes. I have no idea. If only fate had given me a chance. the sky granted her request. But not in the way she had expected. Camille absent-mindedly twirled the flowers in her hands, not knowing whether to combine white with pink or yellow. But what difference does it make to the person to whom she presents these flowers? In any case, will be happy. There she is. The bell behind her back jingled. Camille was not even surprised to see Jenkins at the door. How could anything good happen when her whole life had been a black streak lately? She remained silent, deciding to skip the greeting. Jenkins, oddly enough, didn't look too confident either. Was he ashamed of his last visit here when he'd shown up at the store drunk? It was hard to believe this man had a shred of conscience. Hello? He didn't sound very friendly. Hello, Camille nodded. I'll pick up the bouquet for you if you need it, but I won't take it myself. And I won't go to the restaurant with you or anywhere else. I'm just a salesman here, that's all. Period. She was tired of playing these endless rules of politeness. Camille felt that she just didn't have the energy to smile at anyone. Jenkins stared at her for a while, then remarked sternly, I've earned it somehow. Maybe not, but I just don't have the energy to keep up your game. Camille was surprised at herself for saying that. It was true. Jenkins was just playing with her, and she only realized it now. A game, Jenkins grinned. Okay, let's get serious. If that's the way you like it, I really should ask your father's blessing. Like they used to do in ancient times? Is it called serious? Camille asked bitterly. My father doesn't have time for this right now. He needs a complicated operation, and I have no idea where to get the money for it. And you're here with your courtship? I'm not exactly in the middle of anything right now, so find yourself another victim. Jenkins didn't seem discouraged by her rebuff. It was about money. Now that's business talk, he nodded. How much do you want? What are you talking about? Camille burst into flames. Are you out of your mind? You're offering me God knows what. I'm offering you marriage, silly. You'll marry me and I'll save your father in return. Are you joking again? Or did Camille fail to finish her sentence? Jenkins' offer was too absurd to be taken seriously. We're talking about money, aren't we? Jenkins remarked. Jokes are inappropriate in these matters. I need to think about it, Camille muttered. A couple months ago, she would have slapped herself for saying that, but now she was willing to do anything for her father. It sounds like a bargain to me, Emily said. When the guests had forgotten why they were in the banquet hall and had gone on their merry way. Except they weren't dancing on the tables yet. But it seems it was not far off, because the alcohol was pouring out. That's the deal, Camille replied. Emily gave her a sidelong glance. Doesn't it bother you that Jenkins bought his bride like a commodity in a store? He signed a prenup too. Last I checked, you get nothing in a divorce. Where else would I get that kind of money? Camille answered the question with a question. At least Daddy would still be alive. Nothing else matters. If Christopher only knew the cost of his life, he would prefer to die. Camille, Emily sighed. Don't push it, please. I'm sick enough as it is. Camille wished this evening would end soon, and the thought of going home to Jenkins gave her a real dread. In fact, Emily was right. She had sold herself to save her father. But the thought of being with an unloved husband while John existed somewhere else was unbearable. Finally, the banquet began to come to an end. The music had not died down, and the guests continued to drink, but without the same enthusiasm. Camille herself could not explain what was the matter. It felt like New Year's Eve, when the party was over and all that was left was confetti on the floor. Jenkins approached the table with a firm gait and asked, "Shall we go?" Camille looked helplessly at Emily, who squeezed her hand under the table and whispered, "Everything will work out." They both knew it wasn't true. But how else could Emily help her friend except to assure her that someday her life would start to turn around? Bypassing the cheering guests, they moved towards the exit. Someone congratulated the young people, wished them all the blessings, but Camille heard nothing. Her temples were pounding. She wanted to turn around and run away, just not to see the broad back of the man walking in front of her home, muttered Jenkins, falling into the car. The driver, without asking too many questions, started on his way. Camille felt a fleeting sympathy for the man. While everyone was celebrating, he had been sitting here, waiting for them for ages. However, Camille immediately dismissed those thoughts. The only person to feel sorry for at the moment was herself. It seemed that Jenkins had been embarrassed by the abundance of drink. Either he wasn't in the mood, or he had some notion of propriety, because he didn't molest Camille in the car, and when he arrived at the cottage he mumbled something like "I'll be right back," and left in the direction of the bathroom. Camille stood in the middle of the room, not knowing what to do. She wanted more than anything to throw open the door and run headlong into the garden. But that was a foolish and childish wish. She had made a pact with Jensen, sold herself to him, as Emily had so aptly put it. And most importantly, Camille didn't even know how the door opened here. The phone in her purse vibrated, snapping Camille out of her reverie. The girl looked at the screens, shuddering. John, how often had he called in the past weeks? She hadn't picked up the phone. Now she couldn't stand it. She wanted to hear his voice, even if she couldn't answer. "Hello," Camille whispered softly, glancing at the door behind which her new fiancé had disappeared. She could hear nothing on the other end of the line, but there was a lot of static. Camille pressed the phone to her ear as hard as she could, as if that would help. "And I'm begging you," she said in a voice I can't hear anything. "John, speak louder, please." Jenkins, it sounded to Camille. It's an achingly familiar last name. And then, through your father's interference, Camille's heart dropped. She glanced at the door again for a louder whisper. "What, Jenkins? What did he do, John?" There was a steady white noise coming from the phone, then a beep. John was out of contact. Camille Clamp had managed to find out the truth or stay. There was a noise in the room where Jenkins had hidden. Something seemed to have fallen. Camille could not stay still any longer, rushed to the door, forgetting that it was locked. And then, without thinking long enough, to the window of the dress, clinging to everything she could. Once there was the sound of tearing fabric, but that didn't stop Camille. She jumped down from the windowsill, somehow managing not to move her heeled foot, and rushed away. Luckily, the gate was wrought iron, like a castle fence. Giggling nervously, Camille picked up her skirt and climbed over the fence. Not once in her life had she ever climbed a fence. Now it was as if she had fallen into childhood. Who knew she'd be doing this on her wedding night? Stepping quickly down the street past the sleeping pompous cottages, Camille hailed a cab and turned around fearfully. Just as long as Jenkins didn't notice her absence before she got here. She didn't want to play catch-up with him, arriving on a call. The cab driver, fortunately, did not ask any unnecessary questions. He said ironically that there were still runaway brides in Russia. "I'm an actress," Camille replied. Not to tell the first person you meet all the details of his love story, although there was no love at all. Camille didn't know why Jenkins was attracted to her, but she had the impression that he had married her just for the collection. Evelyn found out that he'd been married 3 times before, and how many unofficial relationships the man had had was hard to guess. Apparently, going to the registry office was no more difficult for him than taking the trash out of the house or visiting the store. Routine. Wary of Jenkins' calls, Camille muted the phone, glancing at the screen only occasionally so she wouldn't miss John's message. What had he found out anyway? Camille texted him, "You're home." But she didn't hear back until 10 minutes later. Yes, that night Camille had been lucky enough to elude Jenkins, catch a cab, and even miraculously find the money in her purse to pay for it. She jumped out of the car, ran to the intercom, and punched the buttons as hard as she could. "John, it's me." She didn't wait for the elevator. She took the stairs to the 5th floor. John opened the door for her, and Camille threw herself into his arms without stopping. Only now she realized how much she missed him. The weeks they hadn't talked seemed like years. Tears spilled from her eyes, bringing her already ruined makeup into a final mess. John awkwardly hugged her back and mumbled, "You know, when I thought about hugging you dressed in your wedding dress, I couldn't imagine it would be like this." Camille cried even harder and promised, "I would explain everything to you. If you want to listen, of course I will. But later. You must listen to me first." The serious tone with which he said those words. John brought the girl to her senses. She was suddenly afraid of the upcoming conversation. They went into the room, and Camille sank down on the couch, awkwardly looking at the folds in her dress. John hesitated and asked, "Did you hear what I told you on the phone?" Camille shook her head. "Not everything, just something about Jenkins and Dad. No details." John nodded understandingly. "It was all my phone. Looks like it's going to the scrap heap. But I had to make do with what I had for now." Camille wanted to ask why he wouldn't buy a new one, but she didn't. She had more important things on her mind at the moment. "What did you find out about my father?" she asked. "And what did Stephen have to do with it? I couldn't call him a husband, not when talking to John. This is about Jenkins. Your dad ended up in the hospital. He's the one who hit Christopher that night." Camille looked at him in amazement. "What makes you think that?" "I don't. I know. Look at this." John walked over to the computer on the table, pressed a couple of buttons, and the screen came to life and a video started playing. Camille had the feeling that John had watched it 100 times, if not more, before she arrived, like some kind of exciting movie. In any case, he commented on almost every frame of the video. "Here's your father, you see, just cleaning up the driveway. And now Jenkins' car will appear from here, on the right, in just a second. Look." Camille, not believing her eyes, looked at the painfully familiar picture of the yard in which she had grown up. That, or the highway figure of her father, who rather shoveled asphalt. Then a car appeared in the frame. Camille couldn't bear to watch it hit her father for a toss and asked, "How do you know it's a Jenkins car?" "There are 1,000 black cars like that in the city. You can zoom in and see the license plate number. And in this age of the internet, you can easily find out who owns it by the license plate number." Camille was speechless for a long time. What John had told her just didn't make sense. Why did he do that? She finally asked. "And how did he end up at my house in the first place? How did he know the address?" Camille remembered what John had just talked about and nodded. "It's all on the internet for sure, though. If anything. Jenkins probably has his own methods of getting information with his kind of money." "A maniac?" Camille was outraged. "Was he following me?" "It turns out he was. But what does that have to do with my father?" "I mean, he tried to kill him, didn't he?" "I think that's probably not what happened." John objected. You could see on the boy's face how hard it was for him to defend his rival. "Jenkins was probably drunk. Went to your house to chase you down? Maybe. And your dad's there. Maybe Jenkins just didn't hit the brakes in time." Camille tried to remember what happened that day. Jenkins showed up at her store with inappropriate advances. He did smell like alcohol. And then they'd talked about the parental blessing. So that's what happened. Jenkins had drunkenly taken Camille's words seriously and gone to see her father. And then... "I hate him," Camille whispered. "First, Jenkins drove my father to a hospital bed, and then he forced me to marry him. Promised to cure a man he almost killed himself. Jenkins blackmailed you?" Camille nodded. "We made a pact with him. I would marry him, and he would pay for my father's operation. That's how I got caught." John was silent. Camille smiled sadly. "Now you despise me. Yes, I left you and married someone else for money. If only you had told me right away." "It's a good thing Emily explained what was going on. She came to talk to me." "You know that." Camille shook her head and John added, "We'll save your father ourselves. You have to dump this guy. You already have. Do you really think I'm going to stay with him after what I found out? By the way, where did you get that tape? We don't have any stores in our yard that might have cameras on them." John smiled. "It's not a camera from the store. You know, when you left me like that without explaining anything, I wanted something to occupy my head, so I decided to do some investigating of my own." "What do you mean?" "I went through your house and the houses across the street to see if anyone had a camera. Nowadays, you can film everything, parking lots and stuff. And you found someone who was watching their car." "No," John grinned. "I found a grandmother who, with the help of her grandson, installed a camera on her balcony in the summer to see who was ripping flowers from her flower bed. If you knew how difficult it was to get into her confidence and convince her that I am not a fraud." "But you did?" Camille asked incredulously. In general, John was not the soul of the company and it was difficult to make new acquaintances. It was strange that he had dared to talk to her on the beach so long ago. After I had thrown down the stairs the real crooks who had almost swindled the poor old lady into installing a new gas stove. I'm second only to her grandson. I didn't know you were such a schemer. I didn't expect me to be honest. Camille thought of Jenkins and his connections inside. No one will believe us that it's Stephen. I think he's bought everything in this town. Why else would even this investigation be so slow? Because no one was interested in helping you, John replied. But everything will work out now. I promise." Camille squeezed his hand gratefully. She was ready to cry again, but this time with happiness. At last she was not alone. John had not deceived her. This SBU investigation had confused the whole area, but it had ended happily in the end. Jenkins was found guilty in court. He mumbled something to himself, probably cursing Camille, but it didn't matter. She was entangled in happiness like armor. Angry words could no longer hurt the girl. John also helped Christopher. Collected from the world, as he put it, turned to his friends. The debt was later paid back from the money the court recovered from Jenkins. One way or another, he gave the money for the operation. Christopher's health was no longer a concern. "I can't believe I have to do this again," Evelyn muttered, signing the wedding invitation. Camille smiled for the second and final time. "This I promise you." They gathered in Camille's room, where they had often gathered during her childhood, and made a mess of things, trying to prepare for the wedding. It was just as much trouble as the first time. Camille wanted to wear a flowered sundress, but Emily insisted on white. Then Emily suddenly broke off the argument and asked, "But are you sure you're happy?" "Because the dress, all the tinsel and the invitations, it's not important. It's what's on your mind that matters." Camille nodded. "Are you 100% sure or not?" 1,000%. "Why do you ask?" "You've always been on John's side. You said we were meant for each other and we should be together. Why are you asking me these questions?" "You've just been so weird lately," Emily said. "You don't seem upset, but you're different." Camille smiled. "I can't hide anything from you." "All right, I'll tell you. Soon there'll be 3 of us." "We already have 3. Evelyn said absent-mindedly, carefully tracing the letters. "Is anyone else coming?" Camille put her hand on her stomach instead of answering. Evelyn immediately threw the pen aside and stared at her. Emily gasped, "You're having a baby." "I didn't tell her, for fear of jinxing it," Camille admitted. So many bad things had happened lately. "Not anymore," Emily assured her. Evelyn nodded. "Why do you think that?" "Because you've already fulfilled your plan for trouble for the rest of your life. And with you, John. Aren't you convinced that you're safe with him?" Camille nodded with a smile. In her heart, she felt the same way. There was nothing but happiness ahead of them. Her life was finally starting to turn white,